it seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the Ukrainian military is now incapable of plugging its gaps. That they're being flanked in regards to the last, let's say, lines of contact, or let's say lines of what's the word I'm looking for? The last military architecture, the Slaviansk Kramatorsk conurbation,
last
and
defensive
on top, last defensive line. Thank you. And that they're unable to fill their gaps, that they're moving and effectively shuffling people from one area to the other, almost like they're fighting fires, leaving
That's
holes
true.
in one.
Yes.
Explain that to us. What is going on
Okay.
the battlefield?
So, there was, the Russian deep penetration
right.
through the Kiev regime's defensive lines as part of their flanking of Pokrovsk, right? To cut off the supply lines into the city, right? Pokrovsk was effectively taken into an operational encirclement, right? Meaning that the Russian artillery and drones covered all of the Kiev regime's remaining supply lines into the city. And then Russian forces surged forward. They exploited one of these holes in the lines where there wasn't enough manpower to defend, and they drove deep into the Kiev regime's rear to the north and then northwest of Pokrovsk, all right, in the south central Donbas. And they were wreaking havoc right there. It was an operational crisis. Now, over the last 5 days, the Kiev regime has launched whatever counterattacks they were able to do, right? We're Azov, the 79th Airborne, they threw everything they had. I've seen a map of about a dozen remnants, because none of them are fully manned, brigades that were thrown up against the one Russian brigade that was the spearhead, the 132nd of the.
It was 12 and the police force.
12. Yeah, it was crazy looking. But again, all of these are undermanned, so take that into account. And they succeeded in stopping the Russians temporarily. And even taking back, if you were taking a look at that weird little bunny ears, the two towns to the either, so everyone was calling it the bunny ears, and I guess it works, right? It accurately describes what you're looking at. They took off the 2 ears, right? So they took a little bit of territory back, and they also gained a little bit of territory around Rodinskoye, which is that is, if they were able to be more successful, then that could provide a bit more of a breather for Pokrovsk, but I don't think they're going to be able to get any further than that. I think what we've seen now is the limits of their counterattack capability, and it's costing them already near Konstantinovka, where Russia is now advancing faster because troops were pulled out of there, and Russia's already moving into Konstantinovka now, which is the bottom end of that defensive line we were talking about, and ultimately not that far from Pokrovsk, right? In fact, divided by the Russian flank now. And Russia is still advancing, with smaller forces committed to these areas, but forces pressing everywhere. Kupiansk, Liman, right? Seversk, Serebranka Forest, and Village are now the Kiev regime commanders now screaming about how critical the situation is in Seversk. And Seversk is the northernmost Kiev regime stronghold in the Donetsk region. It's kind of effectively separated, right? If you will remember back at a point, we were looking at Bakhmut and Sleboda, and then Seversk. And Russia took out Sleboda in the middle, and then eventually took out Bakhmut. And they never committed huge numbers of resources to it. But what they did commit, everything failed to take Seversk. Seversk held for the Kiev regime, much like Ugledar did in the south for the longest time. And these were kind of like the twin strongholds. They weren't big, huge population centers by any stretch of the imagination, but they were effective military strongholds, one to the north and one to the south, Seversk and Ugledar, pinning the Kiev regime's defensives in the Donbas. And first, Ugladar was taken, I guess already close to 3 months ago, and now it looks like Seversk is finally succumbing as well. That was a long. Again, Russia didn't commit massive resources to that. Their timing is their sense of timing for these things happening on the battlefield. They don't commit resources where they don't have to. While everything's supposed to click into place at the right time, as it is now moving on the last defensive line. So it seems they now need to make Seversk fall, so they are. But that's the situation. And I mean, we even had the Telegraph at the end of the last week talking about even the Kiev regime's forces that want to continue fighting don't want to fight for Zelensky, right? And that was
Interesting.
that they hate him, right? And the Telegraph article didn't come out and say it, but of course these are the Banderites, right? They hate Zelensky, right? They want to fight. Nothing will make them stop fighting. They'll fight to the bitter end, but they hate Zelensky, and that puts them in a bit of a pickle because they can't turn on him now, no matter what he does, because that would abandon the front line. But they hate him all the same. So that does, of course, create a further limitation in what he himself is capable of doing diplomatically, because he would be turned on. But I think he's internalized all of this Banderite nonsense at this point anyway. So I don't think it would really make a difference. He obviously has a bit of a messiah complex himself. I mean, his own people have spoken of him as delusional. So
yeah, I see on it.
Russia continues. They're grinding away at the battlefield. The grinding is just happening at a faster rate than it has before. And that rate will continue to increase over time. But still, I will point out how big Ukraine is. I would expect to see sometime by the end of the year another big drive at conscription in Ukraine, aiming at some new, whether we're talking 18 to 25-year-olds or women or both. I mean, that's going to be necessary. But we may yet see a Kiev regime offensive.
Where?
In the Bryansk region. They're attempting to mass forces on the Russian border in the Bryansk region. Again, probably under some insane delusion that they can seize territory briefly in Bryansk, as they did in Kursk, and then trade it to Russia in diplomatic talks that aren't really going to happen anyway. So I don't know why they're bothering with this. The talks are never going to reach that far. But they're attempting to critically mass forces on the Russian border with Bryansk in the north. Again, Belgorod, Kursk, Bryansk, right on the Russian side of the border up there. So they're in the tip of the Sumy region, right? Sumy. Anyway, they're in the Sumy region. They're attempting to mass forces on the Kiev regime side. They've launched a number of attacks on like transmission towers, and they've sent DRG groups in. All these things that you do before you launch an attack. Now, Russia knows this, and they're pounding. Right, they're hitting them with artillery, they're hitting them with missiles. So whether they'll be able to mass that critical mass to effectively bring it together that is needed to launch an offensive, or as they attempt to do so, Russia will be able to destroy it, we're going to find out. But I've heard numbers of 25,000, which is on the upside edge of what they might be capable, and it will of course shorten. Out the other side of that, it will shorten their ability to defend other areas, right? Because those forces could be far better used at least in time, right? Defending somewhere else. It's a lot easier to send a conscripted person to defend a trench line with a gun than it is to order them to make assaults on Russian positions and towns and that sort of thing. It's delusional, but I think we should have long since given up the idea that Zelensky will ever have his military, because Syrskyi just does what he's told, do the logical thing, do the militarily sensible thing. They will never do that. They will never withdraw forces, no matter how strategically, tactically sound that is. They will never do it. They will never, stop trying to, go on the offensive. They're just not going to stop. They do not accept defeat, right? And there's every reason to understand why they wouldn't, because the Europeans are still backing them and, gathering around Zelensky like an adoring horde, and propelling him to Washington and elsewhere, right? And why would he order that? I mean, he hasn't even been in Ukraine in a week, I think, and he's not going to be there soon because he's going to Washington today. So he's at a, I think he's at a psychological degree of removal from the battlefield. First of all, obviously his own people are afraid they cannot tell him the truth because he is an emperor with no clothes. And even what sense that he gets of the real situation on the battlefield, he just refuses to internalize, to acknowledge it, right? It just, duck
I
off
think he's a man in the
back.
future. I mean, the other idea is he's not insane. He just has no future. Like every Ukrainian that he sacrifices is one day extra he gets to live.
I think he's insane. I want to be frank. I think he's mad.
Oh, you think he's just lost it? That he's
I think he's lost it. I think he's a poor little man that was cast into a role that he, as an actor that he has been unable to fulfill, and has just gone mad. I think he's crazy. I mean, in a way that not even Donald Trump is crazy. I think Zelensky is crazy.
What's wild about that? If instead of that stupid offensive, they would have just made their defensive lines, hardened their defensive lines, it would have been a much harder nut to crack, as opposed to losing all of these people.
But hey, we'll dominate the headlines for a couple of weeks, and then there'll be another, yay, sticking it to the Russians, right? I mean, look, Putin can't even defend his own country nonsense. I mean, we can write the headlines now if you want. Again, they may not be able to do it, right? Again, Russia is pounding, right, as they attempt to mass the critical force needed to then surge across the border, right, at a relatively lightly defended area, because what is in Bryansk? Even less than in Kursk, right? I mean, but that's why they're attacking it, right? It's a heavily forested area. It's easy for them to hide stuff, particularly now with foliage, on the trees and everything. They're attempting to mass a critical force, and the reason, again, is primarily narrative driven, right? It's political and narrative driven. It makes no military sense, but we should have long learned the lesson now that they're not making decisions based on military sense, which again ultimately has led to them losing this to the degree that they are. But hey, they'll dominate headlines for a few weeks, and that's more important to Zelensky than anything that makes any sense.
When Seversk and Kramatorsk falls, then what? I mean, at that point, there would effectively be the Russians liberated.
I think you mean Seversk and Konstantinovka. Slavyansk and Kramatorsk will come a little bit after that. So, right. But if you mean what happens after Russia takes Donbas,
yes,
there'll be another wave of hysteria in Europe. There'll be another window of opportunity for them to see sense and come to the negotiation table. And the Russian forces, right? I imagine they'll continue, but there will probably be a bit of a pause still, right? Where the Kremlin will give enough of a breath to say, "Are you done yet?" And they'll say no, and then Russia will continue on to Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkov, right? In a bigger, they're already in both, of course, but in a bigger way, right? I expect that the Donbas will either be liberated or all but liberated by the end of this year, all things considered, right? They're Slavyansk and Kramatorsk might be hanging on by the end of the year, but the writing will be on the wall. And then next year, we'll probably see big moves into Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkov, right? Again, I don't think they'll ever attack Kharkov. They'll probably attempt to force a withdrawal of the Kiev regime forces for Kharkov, but they'll never do that anyway because they never withdraw. So that'll force some kind of confrontation there. I would really like to see them make another play for Kiev sometime next year. I think that the Kiev regime forces, I don't think they're going to collapse again to the extent that some people do, that they're just going to one day say, we can't fight anymore, let's sign surrender papers. But I think they'll crumble enough that Russia will be able to one of the things Russia is not doing on their offensive now is they're not using large numbers of military vehicles, right? They're not using armor. They're using very limited numbers of infantry fighting vehicles and APCs. Why? Because still of the threat of drones. It's not worth it. But as they continue to dominate the battlefield more, and they're making all these offensives without that, right? This is essentially drone and artillery and FAB assisted infantry, right? That's what's happening right now. But both sides have long since switched to that. It's just the realities of drone warfare and 24/7 satellite surveillance. It demands a new battlefield. But eventually, the Kiev regime's ability to screen their forces with drones, their defensive positions, that's weakening, right? And then they're already experiencing such gaps in manpower terms in their defenses that Russia will be able to sometime within the next year, right? Any time from 2 months to a full year from now, be able to reinsert large numbers of armored vehicles because there won't be as much of a threat to waste them because of drone screens. And that will make things move much faster, of course. And that will open up the opportunity for another move on Kiev, another, decapitation strike. But, that's already months into the future. Then we're way in fog of war territory there.
No, I understand. Can we talk about Azerbaijan real quick before what time is it?
If we must.
I am fascinated by this. God, man, I am fascinated by this. I love the this kind of subversive politics that takes place in countries. Russia would come out overtly. Azerbaijan is taking an unfriendly action. It is okay. We still want to make diplomatic relations. The world is great. And then, bam, there's your oil refinery. Bam, there's this building that you apparently had in Ukraine. Meaning they're effectively using Ukraine as a grounds by which to exert pressure on Azerbaijan. Like recently, I think it was yesterday, maybe even, they blew up one of Azerbaijan's main oil refineries in Ukraine. And apparently there were several mercenaries that were liquidated, quote unquote, which one being caught, and come to find out these were mercenaries that were let out of Azerbaijan prisons in order to fight in the war in Ukraine. We also, on some level, believe that Azerbaijan had been working in order to assist with either drones being flown into Russia. So you have, in some case, Russia hitting these various aspects of Azerbaijan from an economic standpoint and going after some of the mercenaries that are in Ukraine. Basically, we are going to use Ukraine as a platform by which to go after you. Even though,
and that's okay because Azerbaijan is going to do the same.
Yes. Well, I don't think it's okay either way, just because I think it's screwed up that both countries are doing it. But whatever, they're doing it, right? Yeah. It's fascinating to me that this is taking place.
And understand that everything that Azerbaijan does has Erdogan looming behind it.
Interesting.
I mean,
interesting.
Aliyev is Azerbaijan's sidekick. Come on. Everything that he does is agreed to with Erdogan.
But Azerbaijan is not a proxy of Istanbul, is it? I mean,
yeah, they are. I mean, they're at least a junior ally of. I mean, that would be generous. I think. I mean, everything they do is backed by Turkey. Everything that happened with Armenia was backed by Turkey, right?
Yes.
All of this whole supposed trip road, this Trump, this insertion of the U.S. as a geopolitical coup d'etat.
Whatever that thing's called.
What was previously the Zangezur corridor, now the Trump route for international peace and prosperity. All right.
Which, by the way, is anything but.
I have nothing to base this on, but I am, or very little, I should say. I have a belief that this was all Erdogan's plan that he presented to Trump. This is the cunning beast plan.
Well, I do think
to drag the U.S. into the Caucasus.
But the U.S. would want to do that anyway, right? I mean, from my standpoint, primacy. I have no belief that the U.S. is given a primacy, and in the same way that Trump is like, "Hey, Putin, let's make a deal," while I simultaneously work in Armenia and Azerbaijan in order to get into the soft underbelly.
The problem is that Armenia is a landlocked country, right? With a high degree of political opposition to their West-backed leader, that is, repressing the population, the Armenian Apostolic Church, everything at this point. And previous U.S. presidents have had the sense to not send forces there, to understand that was beyond their geopolitical reach, right? Stir up domestic, support Pashinyan from afar, sure, but they weren't going to get dragged into it. But this whole idea of selling it to Trump as a lease of a PMC or corporation, and the U.S. basically buying, parachuting in and buying out the South Caucasus, right? That to me just speaks of Erdogan, selling Trump on an idea that he can't resist. Much like Trump is, well, again, when I say Trump, someone, it was put forward by the Trump administration to buy the Nord Stream pipelines and restart the flow of energy to Europe, but under U.S. control, right? I mean, that this sort of appeal to companies doing things as proxies of the U.S. is very Trumpian, right? That it's not something that has a history before that. So that's why, and Erdogan has been shepherding this whole, bringing of Aliyev and Pashinyan together, right? Of convincing Pashinyan to go along with it, right? Pashinyan is essentially selling out Suksyn province in Armenia to Armenia's own historical and present-day enemies, Turkey and Azerbaijan on either side. Why? Because he believes that this secures him a place in the Western geopolitical influence sphere, and he's willing to sacrifice his own country for that. They found a way to sell this corridor under U.S. protection, right? Under U.S. ownership for 100 years, right? And that is, now the Russians or Iranians are obviously taken aback by all of this.
Yes, which is why
they're divided on a response. The Iranians are making all sorts of threats, right? And
it's
military threats. Well, the Russians are more reserved, shall we say. I think part of the calculation in the Kremlin is this is never going to work. They're never going to be able to pull this off. The logistics of it are just insane. And the domestic political opposition in Armenia will grow, and Pashinyan will have to shove this through domestic political bodies at some point. It is just never going to work. That's why I think you haven't seen as much of a response from Russia as the more visceral response that you've seen from Iran. Now, is that going to be the way it plays out? I don't know, right? I don't know whether America can really pull this off. But it is without a doubt that something that the Russians and the Iranians are both like, you're going to what?
Why are the Russians being so cavalier with this? Like that, I got to be honest, Mark, that annoys the hell out of me.
They don't think it's going to work. They think it's a crazy Hail Mary pass that is ultimately going to be dropped, right?
Okay.
That the
I hear you.
logistics of supplying a PMC in a war-torn, hatred-riven South Caucasus, south of Russia, that you're going to, I don't know, Berlin airlift supply a PMC there and make it work, right? And smooth over relations between Armenia and, get Armenia to play dead long enough, for all of this to go through. I just don't think, I think ultimately there'll be political opposition in Armenia that will take back the leadership of their country, that will reject all of this. And then almost certainly you'll see a resuscitation of war between Armenia and Turkey and Azerbaijan, at which point Turkey and Azerbaijan will, like wolves from both sides, will just rip our southern Armenia apart.
Yes.
And
Again.
Armenia is in its own way going to be fed into this geopolitical meat grinder against Russia. And the truth of the matter is that since the end of the Soviet Union, Russia was going to inevitably lose influence in the South Caucasus, right? This has all been building. They have maintained influence there by maintaining the balance between Armenia and Azerbaijan, diplomatically, militarily, but also to a certain extent, let's be honest, playing one another off of each other. Well, that game is now.
You have to explain why, though. I don't understand why. Like, why did they
for control? For control, because they were the biggest dog. Why are they going to lose influence? Because that game is now over, right? Nagorno-Karabakh, Pashinyan surrendered it to Turkey. Yes. The occupied territories are over. Armenia is a weak country, right? They're a landlocked little country with no natural resources, and Armenia and Azerbaijan and Turkey are both flush and feeling very, shall we say, expansionist and feeling their strength. They know that both Russia and Iran are focused elsewhere geopolitically, so they're flexing, right? And they can do it. And Russia, at this point, I'm sure there's people that in the Kremlin are saying, the South Caucasus. You know what I'm saying? It's yes, geopolitical terms, the soft underbelly and everything, but really, we're done with it, right? I mean, to a certain extent, they're like, it's not worth it to get drawn into that rat's nest. And certainly they're everything on their plate is now consumed with defeating NATO in Ukraine, right? I mean, that has to be the priority over everything. So yeah, Azerbaijan is feeling their strength. Again, it's a thing that there was probably long simmering Azerbaijan resentment under the surface, but for 2 decades, more than 2 decades now, Russia and Azerbaijan have had very, I don't want to say friendly, but very effective business-like, relations. And now all of a sudden that's up in flames. Azerbaijan is,
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just saying that's the part I'm confused by.
Who are Aliyev's 2 biggest allies?
Well, Turkey and I don't know the other one.
Israel.
Oh, right. I got a new axis, but I guess it's not a new axis.
So yeah. I mean, well, it's been an axis in formation, and now it's more so than ever before, right? There's payback for everything geopolitically, and Iran not only gets a little bit of payback against Russia, but they get a lot of maneuver against Iran, right? Because Azerbaijan is right there, and if this whole thing comes to fruition, then Iran's trade route to Armenia, and thus, a land trade route, will be completely cut off. There's all of this. Russia still has a military base in
Armenia,
but Pashinyan wants that gone. That's part of all of this maneuvering. He wants out of the Russian sphere of influence, and he wants the Western sphere of influence extended over Armenia and the rest of the South Caucasus. And Turkey and Azerbaijan, I believe, have sold this project to Washington now, as an extension. Now, Turkey and Azerbaijan, of course, have their own game, right? Yes, dovetailing with the West here, bandwagon, bringing the U.S. in and everything. But ultimately, they've got their Erdogan has his vision on some pan-Turkic sphere of influence, and ultimately, part of what they want to do on an economic level is sell China on the stability of the own middle corridor for the One Belt, One Road to go under Russia, rather than investing in the over route over the Caspian Sea, right, into this. And now China will have to make both an economic and a geopolitical decision on that, but that's at least part of Erdogan's calculation here. So it's from Azerbaijan. Yeah, energy pipelines, gas pipelines from Azerbaijan will now go through this previously Zangezur corridor through Armenia into Turkey and then on to Europe, right? Providing Europe with, well, not as much natural gas as Russia could, but, at least a partial pipeline supply, which is cheaper and more reliable than U.S. shipped LNG. So big pipeline politics are calculation
One last
of what's
question
going on.
before I let you go. Do you think there's secret provisions in the deal set between Azerbaijan and Armenia that would bring them into NATO?
I think there are probably not. I think that probably it was discussed, and then probably, anything's possible, right? And it was discussed as a future development if it all works out, right? But I don't think that there was a secret protocol signed into it where that is something that is automatically going to happen. That's a more distant prospect. But certainly the U.S. would love to then, you don't want NATO close to your border? Here's two more. We took Finland and Sweden, and now in the Caucasus, we've got your former, client states, Armenia and Azerbaijan as well. I absolutely believe that there are some people in the bowels of the Russia desk, right, in the U.S. deep state, who are there. We can see where this is going, that are absolutely on board. Does that mean that Trump, is aware of this? I don't know. It's possible. I mean, he doesn't even attend most of his intelligence briefings, so he gets his news from Fox. And what Trump knows and doesn't know is a fool's game, because ultimately it does not matter, because the institutions of the hegemon are on autopilot, right? Where they receive resistance and obstruction from Trump, they just manage that, flow around it and continue on with their what is their inevitable, process, regardless. I'm sorry, I'm a structural realist.
You are fantastic, and I deeply appreciate you on this. We are going to see how this all plays out. Thank you for delving into the Azerbaijan-Armenia thing. I'm sorry I was pushing just because I was trying to get it into in a certain amount of time frame. Thank you for this, Mark. Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at MarkSleboda1, and you can find him on Boosty, Boosty, at Realpolitik with Mark Sleboda, or under the name just Mark Sleboda. Mark, you have a fantastic day, man. Thank you for this.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye. All right. Best in the business, Mark Sleboda. I want to go to my next